She said you were a little tired, but she said she wants to do it again.
Yeah, I told her next Monday. She's up for it.
Questions from last week? Questions from last week? No news is good news on that front, I guess. So we're going to start about where we finished last week. It might take us 45 minutes or so to work through those couple problems, and then we'll review assignment number 1. I think I have a few more power problems at the start of that PowerPoint presentation for week 3 that we might work through as well. We'll see how comfortable you are with working the problems. And then we're really going to start doing some of the heavy lifting in terms of using SPSS, where we understand something about if we have missing data, the nature of that missing data, and what possible solutions there might be at hand. And then we'll look at outliers and normalities. And then, but before we do that, we'll spend some time and go over the first assignment in as much detail as we need to. So as we cover those other 3 topics, you'll have a clear understanding of what you're going to expect to do for the homeworks, and where we see where it's not clear, we can try to cover that to the extent possible. Sound like a plan? And so if we get back to, somebody give me a definition of statistical power. How do you define, how would you explain statistical power to?
The probability that there's a relationship between variables.
The probability that there's a relationship between variables, I think that's a little too general. There's some parts of that I like, but there's other parts that I'm not sure that I think would square. Somebody else go with.
We could say the probability of avoiding a type 2 error.
Yeah, and that's the one I really like for some reason. I understand what a type 2 error is, and it's the likelihood of not making that error. That's pretty, for me, that's pretty straightforward, but there's some of those other definitions. Again, I would, if I were you, I would encourage you to find one of those that work for you, because I think it'll just be not just for this class. It probably won't be all that helpful for this class, but as you sort of move forward in your academic endeavors, I think it'll probably serve you well. So I need to. So we did the first one, right, where we used the Cohen article. Let's just do the first one for the heck of it again. So we used the Cohen article, and the problem is what's the approximate? And remember, this is the kind of power analysis that is most useful, is to determine what's the approximate sample size that's needed for your study, right? Of the 4 different kinds of power analysis, that's the one that seems most useful. And so in this case, we're wanting the approximate sample size needed for a multiple regression with 7 independent variables, an alpha of 0.05, an anticipated R-square of 0.2, and the power is going to be set at 0.8. And so the 0.8 and 0.2, I think I won't try to trick you up with any problems I give you where I ever change those. I think they're fairly standard, and there's no probably upside in changing those. Maybe for some of your work you might for one up or down for whatever reason. And so remember, we sort of had this 2-step process if we're going to use the Cohen article. We're going to start with table 1, and we're going to find the effect size index that Cohen wants us to calculate from table 1. We're going to calculate that index. In some cases, there's not much calculation that's needed. We're going to calculate that index. Then we're going to go to table 2, and we're going to plug that index into that table and come up with either an exact number as defined by Cohen or some range of numbers that range of sample size that we might need. And I think for this one we come up with a range. And so the effect size index is R over 1 minus R squared, which is what again? 0.25. And so we have to remember 0.25. I guess what we have to remember is not the 0.25. We have to remember, where does 0.25 fall on the effect size spectrum? Is it small, medium, or large? In between medium and large, right? It's in the middle, right? Exactly in the middle? Huh? Marge? I like that, yeah. And by the way, speaking of things that I like, what would be, if we were just talking about R squared, what would we consider a large effect size? Remember we talked about that, small, medium, and large?
The 0.25 was the large, the 0.02 was the small, and the 0.01 the small, and the medium 0.09.
Yeah, and so for small it's 0.01 R squared, right? Not R, but R squared. And then 0.09 for medium, and 0.25. I think they're probably on that table somewhere, that table 1. If it's not on table 1, you can find it. I think on the page 156. Okay, so we have the 0.25 somewhere between medium and large. We go to table 2. We go to number 8, which is multiple R. Doesn't say multiple regression, but it's multiple R, and you just have to know that that's what we're looking for. We do number of independent variables is equal to 7. We go across, because we're always going to use alpha as 0.05. And the sample size, the max we might need would be what? 102. And the min would be? Yeah, so not particularly helpful. There's a range there that again, it's probably a bit large for most of our purposes, but at least you'd be better than if that's all you had, you'd be better off than just taking a guess at what you needed for a sample size, or just collecting data until the cows come home and you collect 10 times more data than you might actually need. And so probably the preferred way, and there'd be really no good reason why, unless you're stranded on a desert island without a computer and all you have is the Cohen article, there'd be no good reason why you wouldn't use the G-Power. Did everybody get G-Power on their computer? So again, remember that my resolution here is a little funky because I'm trying to mirror the resolution on the screen here, and so it cuts off some of this stuff, and so you guys can help me out. If you're following along on your computer and doing this, you can help me as we plug in some of this data, because again, I can't resize the window, and which is sort of odd that you can't even resize the window, but it is what it is. So we want to do that same problem again, and then we'll move on from that problem. And so we want to do regression, and we just have to remember, and we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, the R squared coefficient is tested with an F test, and you'll see that F test when we start working with multiple regression here in a couple weeks. And so you just have to remember the test family is going to be F test, and then we can scroll down that list of possible F tests that we can calculate power for, and the one that we'll want is linear multiple regression, mixed model, R squared deviation from 0. Because we want to know, does our R square, we want to test whether our R square varies significantly from 0. If you're doing some study where you want to know if R square varies significantly from some other point, like say 0.1 or 0.25, then you would choose the one below it. I don't know when you would use that, to be honest, but you do have that option. We want to do a priori power analysis for everything that we're going to do, which we want to compute the required sample size. and we then can put in our inputs here. We can do the determine by, and oftentimes if you click determine, it is useful because you can put in some inputs here, and you can save yourself the hand calculation. It'd be the same hand calculation you do with Cohen. What was the R square? 0.2?
5, right.
The,
0.5. 0.5.
the R square was for that problem? 0.2, right?
Right.
And so I plug 0.2 in there. I plug 0.2 in there. I can't see what it gives me because it's off my screen. But if you plug 0.2 in there and say calculate, what does it tell you? You better say 0.25. 0.25, right? And so you can tell it to actually move that to the window if you want to. And so if you tell it to move it to the window, it's actually going to move it to right there. So our effect size, that is in f squared, is 0.25. Alpha is 0.5. The default here is 0.95. Don't forget to change that. I know in homeworks, some people just forget that, and you end up with a sample size that is slightly larger than what you should have. Number of predictors equals 7, and we press enter, and I get, what do we get for the number? What is it? 65, and I can only go this low. Maybe if I move the bar, but can I tell this bar to go away? Anybody know?
Under dock, you just go to hide.
What's that?
You click on dock, and you can click on hide, or you can click on hover.
I can say, I can put it on the side. I thought there's a way for it to auto hide, but we're there. That'll work for now. But there we have, we can see to the bottom of the screen, and we get 65, right? So the right answer there, sample size needed, would be 65, which is in between the, what was it, 120 and 48, or 102 and 48, what was it?
102 and 48.
Yeah, so it's clearly in between that, as you would expect it to be, okay? Make sense? The next problem, we did 2, so we won't do 2 again. If you want to go, did we finish 2? Yeah, that just, okay. So I have 3. You anticipate an R of 0.2. Alpha is going to be 0.05. Power is going to be 0.8. What is the approximate n needed for t-test of the significance of a product moment correlation? Also oftentimes referred to as Pearson's correlation coefficient. So it's just the standard correlation coefficient. Some people call it product moment correlation. And so we'll do the Cohen article first. And let's see what the test, find our test on there. We find our test on there, and I think it's just going to be number 2. Significance of product moment R. And the effect size index is simply R, right? Everybody follow that on table 1? And so our R is 0.2, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is that small, medium, or large?
In between small and medium.
Yeah, isn't it middle way between small and medium? So it's middle between small and medium. So then we'll flip the page to table 2. And again, test number 2. Alpha is 0.05. The max might be, our max would be what?
783.
And the min would be even less useful, right? Because it's just such a large range that, again, only if you were stranded on a desert island and only had the Cohen article would you ever probably go that route. You'd probably use G-power or something that would give you a better number. So let's do that and see what we come up with. And so the test family, one would think that it would go under t-test. And you'll just have to remember this. So a t-test and a point biserial correlation is a slightly different correlation. It's where one of your variables is just a dichotomy and the other variable is continuous. And we'd call that a point biserial correlation, which isn't the one that we would typically want, because in most cases we have two variables that are interval or ratio level. And so the test for that is under exact test. And again, there's not a good way you just have to have a note for that. And the next time you need to do this, just know that, unless I tell you point biserial correlation, which I don't think I do, but we're going to do an exact test. And the test that we're going to do is correlation bivariate normal model. We're going to do a priori. You should always do two-tail. There's never a good reason to do a one-tail test. There's never a good reason to do a one-tail test. It's really sort of an outdated way to test hypotheses. Has a bad stigma associated with it. It tends to be that, and this is cynical for sure. It tends to be that people use a one-tail test if their two-tail test isn't significant, because you can divide the p-value by 2, and it just really has a pretty it's not a particularly it's just not the way that we should test hypotheses. So always two-tailed test. And so alpha is going to be 0.05, power is going to be 0.8, so we've got to change that. The null hypothesis is going to be 0, and our correlation for H1, I think, is, what did I say, 0.2? What is it? 0.2? Is that right? I think that, so this should give us 193. Does that fall in between the min and max that we calculated with the Cohen article? Does that make sense? Questions? Easy enough to do? And so I think the fourth one that we can think about, and this one,
Can I quickly ask, in the test families of t-test, would we use, we had a dichotomous and a continuous, and the exact is if we had two continuous?
That's right. Or you could use the point biserial if you had two dichotomous. In some cases, people. So if you have a dichotomy, it would be point biserial. The difference in n might be, in this case, 5 or 6, one direction or the other. So it's probably not going to make. It probably wouldn't be a fatal error if one just picked the wrong one. And you could go to the help page that the developers of the software have, because they talk a little bit about the point biserial versus the exact test, and why they did it that way, if that's of interest. And so back to the slide, and in this case, for 4, we have 3 groups. Group 1, 2, 3. What tests would we be doing? Yep, so it'd be ANOVA, right? If it was just 2 groups, we could just do a t-test, right? You could do it in ANOVA too, but t-test would be more typical. So we have 3 groups, so we're going to do an ANOVA. Do I say ANOVA there? I don't, but you just would have to know that from, the problem, that 3 groups, and I give you 3 means, and I give you the pooled standard deviation, which is something that can't be derived. It's the standard deviation across all of your data. We refer to that as the pooled standard deviation, which obviously you can't calculate from this. It's a piece of information that I need to give you. And then if we look at the Cohen article, we see that it gets a little. We see that for 7, it gets a little bit more complicated in terms of the effect size calculation. And so this would be all the more reason why you wouldn't want to use the Cohen article, and you just could use or use G power to do the calculation. But because we're working with the article, I just wanted to take you through this as well because while a little more complicated, it's not out of our realm of understanding for sure. And so number 7, you can see where on page 157, Cohen talks about, for number 7, for a one-way analysis of variance, assuming equal sample sizes for the G, in our case, 3 groups, the F test has, and it gives us the degrees of freedom, which isn't particularly useful for us here right now. But he says the effect size index, so I'm reading that second to the last sentence there, the effect size index is the standard deviation of the G population means divided by the common within sample standard deviation. The common within sample standard deviation is this number that I'm giving you here. And then he tells us what we need to have is the standard deviation of the G, in our case 3, population means. We don't have population data, all we have is sample data, so we'll use sample data. And the calculation, as you'll see from my scribble here, should be your next slide, is recall that the formula for standard deviation is the sum of xi minus x bar, right? Divided by n minus 1. This is the formula for standard deviation for a sample. Divided by n minus 1. That would be the formula for variance right there, right? And if we take the square root of that, that's the that's the formula for standard deviation. I'm sorry, you probably can't see that very well there, but so that's what I'm doing here. Although, as he says, we're working with population, and so instead of n minus 1, it's n. So that's the calculation that we're going to do. And we'll talk a little, and this is referred to as our degrees of freedom. In this case, we have n degrees of freedom. If we're working with sample data, we have n minus 1 degrees of freedom. And when we talk a little bit more in the coming weeks, I know that the idea of degrees of freedom is just sort of, you probably have seen it before, but it might not sort of resonate in terms of what it is. But it really is what it sounds like. It's how many degrees of, how much can our thing vary? And in this case, it can vary by n. In some cases, it can only vary by n minus 1 or n minus 2. And I'll give you some examples of that. So degrees of freedom will be something that isn't just a DF that you see in an article. You'll actually have some intuition as to why it is what it is. And so just using that formula, I took the means for the 3 groups, took the overall mean, so 6 plus 5 plus 6 divided by 3 is 5.67. So it's the mean minus the overall mean. Of course, if you sum these up, they'll always sum to 0, with the exception of some rounding error. But we square this. We square each of these, and we come up with 6.667. And then to get the standard deviation for the population, it's 0.667 divided by the sample size, which is 3, 1, 2, 3. We get 0.471. And the 0.471 divided by the pooled standard deviation, that's 2.32, gives us 2.03. So that's the number that Cohen is looking for us to calculate with number 7 on table number 1. I would never ask you to do the hand calculation. The mathematics is pretty straight. It's right. It's the most difficult thing you have to do up there is square root, right? And so as long as you have a calculator, it's pretty straight. But it just isn't anything that's of interest for us here. And so I wouldn't worry about sort of digesting this in all its detail. If there's some parts of it that you're curious about or you just don't get and you want to talk about it, I'm happy to help. But if it's not perfectly clear, I think you'll probably be just fine if you sort of understand. After we get this number, we go back to the article, table 1, and we have, is it small, medium, or large?
In between small and medium.
Yeah, closer to medium than it is to small, but just somewhere between small and medium. And so then we flip to table 2, and you guys are probably way ahead of me by this point. 3 groups, right? And the max would be what?
322.
The min would be,
50.
thank you.
I had to talk about that there.
And remember, that's the sample size per group. 3 groups, so it'd be 322 times 3 or 52 times 3, right? So that would be the total N that you need for your study. And just to make sure that you should, in your article on page 156, under sample size, he says, for a statistical test involving 2 or more groups, N, as defined here, is the necessary sample size for each group. Double underline each group. So you don't accidentally say, well, the sample size can be 322 when it really needs to be, what, 966?
Times.
Does that make sense? So then we can, so what did we get? We have a 966, is that what it is? 240, yeah, isn't it? 966 for the max, and the min would be 152?
52 times 3, right?
Yep, so 156. So we'll see if we can get G power to land somewhere in between there. Again, you might not know this, or it might be something that you need to review, and we'll certainly work on it over this semester when we talk about ANOVA. But it is an F test that we do for an ANOVA. So that's the test family. We're not doing linear regression. We're doing and when we say one way, does anybody remember I mentioned this last week? One way means what?
One independent variable.
Yeah, and so it's just one independent variable. It's a pretty straightforward test with only one main effect and no interaction. So that's the one we want. We get a pop-up window over here, and again, I'm sort of limited by my resolution here. But we can put in, how many groups do we have? 3? And leave the sample size as what, if they're all the same, if it's 5 or whatever, it doesn't matter. And what were our means? 5?
6, 5, 6.
So 6. 6. 5. 6, is that what you said, Chris?
Yes.
Thank you.
How did you get to once you put it in?
Double click on it.
On the where you input the mean value?
You actually need to click on the digit.
Yeah,
Rather
on the 0.
Yeah, and so what do you have to do? You actually have to click on the digit?
Yeah, not the text box.
A little funky that way. And then I think this needs to be our, what is the pool standard deviation? 2.32, and if I press enter, well, I don't want to press enter yet. I want to say determine, but I can't see it. What is it if you say determine or say calculate? What does it give us? 1 second. The only way I can make sense of that. What does it give us? 0.203? 0.2 what?
0.203.
Sorry, Chris. Yes. So rounds to, it seems like, our calculation here. And then we can transfer that to the effect size. So it's 0.203, right? And alpha is 0.05. Power is going to be 0.8. Number of groups is going to be 3. And I press enter. And it tells me we need 237. But 237 is total n, not n per group. So just have to remember, Cohen is giving you n per group. G power is giving you total n. Obviously, you're going to divide that by 3 to say I need approximately this number of people for each of my conditions if you're doing an experimental study.
Okay, so G power gives you the total
Sample size, yes.
sample size, and if you want to know which each group is, then we divide it by the number of groups.
That's right. That's right. Questions?
This is more a G power question, but if I didn't get a pop-up, like, that popped out from that, would it be?
The determine button on the left.
Got it, Marissa?
How do you
Okay.
delete the groups?
Tell it the number of groups you want, right?
Oh,
And I think as long as the sample size is, it could be 50, but if they're all 50, you're going to be fine. It's going to be the same thing. If you have one sample size that's larger, or just make sure that they're all the same number. It doesn't matter what the number is. But it might have to be something other than 0. All right? Questions on statistical power? I do have a few problems that we'll work, and I think maybe what we'll do is we'll get started talking about assignment number 1. We'll get started talking about missing data. We'll take a break, let statistical power sort of fade into your memory somewhere, and then we'll come back and try to recall that and do those couple problems that I have at the start of the deck of work for of slides for week 3. All right. So we'll come back to these in a minute, but let's, before we do that, let's, did you find the assignment 1 sheet on Canvas? Yes, it's there. So let's go through this in as much detail as we can take, or is that we need, just to make sure that we have a clear understanding. So this technically is due next week, right?
Yeah.
By class time next week. There's a folder, I think it's up there now already, but if it's not, I'll make sure it's up there. It will only accept a PDF. So that's one of the nice things about Canvas is you can tell it's the only file that you can take. It's a PDF. So if you try to upload your Word document, I don't know what kind of error message it's going to give you, but you should be able to convert a Word document, if that's what you're working in, pretty easily to a PDF. If you have problems doing that, let me know and I can try and help you. But I think most of us have probably done that enough. And so that's where you're going to upload your homework. I'm reasonably certain that we won't get through all of week 3 slides today. And so before we leave today, we'll figure out where we ended up. And part of this homework, if we get through it all, it will all be due next Wednesday. But if we don't get through it all, I'm going to make due next Wednesday the parts that we get through, okay? And then the rest of it will be due the week after that. And I don't think there's another homework that week. And so we'll try not to double up. If we do, we'll push that one out another week if we need to. So make sure that I clarify what I'm expecting you to turn in before we leave today. For sure, what you'll be able to turn in is number 2. There's some problems where I need you to do power analysis. And I want you to use G power. I didn't show you again, but there's that graph up there that I said, I talked a little bit about it. But if you click up there, there's a, what do they call it? Protocol of power analysis. And it'll actually show you what your inputs were and what your N is. And you can copy and paste that just like you would copy and paste anything. And that's what you're going to give me for A, B, and C. Okay? So that's 2. Easy enough?
For 2B, is it 34 groups?
Wouldn't be 34 groups, would it? Do either 3 or 4. You decide.
Okay.
So I probably meant to put one of the two, but just make a note to self to either do 3 or 4. I could tell you to do both, but just do one or the other, okay? And I'll figure it out. The one thing that I didn't do, let me just go back to, because we didn't do this. So one of the a nice thing about G-Power, or I don't know that it's nice, but a feature of G-Power is if you mouse over the effect size box, it will show you the small, medium, and large effect size, which squares with the Cohen article. And so if I tell you, like for 2 or B, I just say medium effect size. All you need to do is make sure you have the right test up there, mouse over the effect size, medium is 0.25, plug 0.25 in there, make sure everything else is right, and you'll have the correct answer. The other way you could do that is you could go to the table 1 in the Cohen book, calculate F, look at Cohen's article, or look at Cohen's article to see what a medium is in this case. And then he's going to say it's 0.25 and then plug the 0.25 in. I don't know why you do that. So you should be able to just mouse over. I think you have to let it hover there for a second. Everybody, can you get that to work? Those of you that are using a PC.
Yep.
So, like now it won't. Huh?
I think it's because you're like clicked into the box. You click outside of the box and then hover over it again.
There we go. Good. So make sure don't do that because it won't come up, I don't think. Do this and then mouse over it, and there you have it, okay? So that's what you're going to do for B. So remember for B, you're not doing 34 groups. Nobody do 34 groups, please. Do either 3 or 4 groups, okay? You don't have to do both. Just make yours either 3 or 4 groups. All right? Uh-huh.
In the protocol of harm analysis, there's 3 elements. There's an analysis element, an input, and an output. So you want us to have the whole copy paste.
I would just copy and paste the whole thing like this, and then you can just copy that into a Word document, and I would put the whole thing in there. In this case, I have all of the problems that I've worked, and so I guess my preference would be that you clear that. I press delete and it doesn't clear. Maybe you have to kill it and start it back up, and it'll be clear. But you can do all 3 of these problems and then copy and paste all of it, as long as you don't add in a couple extra problems along the way. Or if you do, you can just edit them out of the Word document when you paste it into Word, okay? Make sense? Other questions? All right, and then, so that's the easy part. So then the more time, and it really is, I don't know that it's the most difficult homework, but it really is one because we just sort of, I'm making some assumptions. This is advanced stats. I'm making some assumptions about your abilities, and if those assumptions are wrong, this could be like the homework from hell. But if you find that to be the case, we need to meet and talk because, and I'm not going to coach you out of the class for sure. You're here and you're not going anywhere. But what we can do is we can just work through whatever challenges you're having with your data and what I'm asking you to do. Okay. And so, and I don't say that to alarm you. I say that to maybe motivate you to start earlier instead of later. So if you start Wednesday morning, I won't be able to see you Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday at all probably. So you should start earlier and try to meet with me earlier. That's always that'd be better for you. That'd be better for me. And so I think that would be key. Some of you that have good experience, you'll find this to be smooth sailing. It will still take a lot of work because there's a fair amount of there's some calculations you have to do and just sort of thinking through some things. It still will take you, even if you understand all of the aspects that we discuss relative to missing data, outliers, and normality. There's still a lot of work there. But if you don't quite understand some of the concepts or how we assess those concepts, it makes it sort of double trouble. And so make sure that we are able to get together sooner rather than later.
First aid, you sort of mentioned relevancy, like in some instances if we're flipping the IV and DB and really the theory postulated. So I mean, we could just sort of mention it and say, just for our purposes, we flipped it.
Right, and just looking at A, B, C, and D for A, and those of you that I haven't met with about data, which unfortunately I think there might be a couple people. If you're one of those people, we need to talk soon. Some of you that I did meet with, where the conclusion was uncertain, we need to make sure that we bring some certitude to that really soon. And so let's have that conversation here in the next day or so at the most. Again, don't wait till the weekend. I just think it will get risky to make sure that everything falls into place. And so for number A, I just want you to write a paragraph. And if you're not an expert in, so I know a number of you are working with data that Ryan Beisel gave you, and some of you, is it MUM theory? And if that isn't your theory of expertise, I'm not asking for that here. I just want you to mention the theory, maybe tell me just a little bit about that theory, a sentence or two. Tell me a little bit about the data that you're using, some of the relationships that might be interested. And you can just talk in terms of correlations, or you can talk in terms of differences. I think this independent variable will be correlated with these dependent variables, or I think this grouping variable, this independent variable, there will be significant differences across some dependent variables. So I'm not looking for a lot of detail there. I'm not looking for more than a paragraph for sure. And so you can just be pretty concise and to the point, and just help me to refresh my memory in terms of the data that you're working with, okay? And so that's A. B, I'm asking you to examine your data for missing values. Put a note here if you don't have any missing data. We're going to create some missing data for you, okay? And so that's not a reason to not do number B or letter B. So if you have no missing data, essentially what I'll ask you to do is to pick a couple variables, randomly go through it and delete 25% of the data, and you're going to be good to go, okay? Make a copy of it before you do that so you don't get rid of data that you want to work with. But I suspect that most of you have some missing data. And the other part of this would be, let's say you have a variable where, let's say your n is equal to 250, and you're only missing 2. 2 of the 250 didn't answer the question. There's not a whole lot that we can do in terms of determining whether those 2 people were systematically different than the people who did give you the data, because it's such an unbalanced, it's 248 that gave it to you, 2 that didn't. It's such an unbalanced analysis that it's useless to do. So if you have that kind of situation, and I don't know where to draw the line. Maybe an arbitrary number would be like maybe 10, 15 might be another number, but they're sort of arbitrary, and I'd be open to, if you think 7's a better number, and that's what you have, I probably would be open to you doing that as well. But if you, just one point, if you if you find yourself in a situation where you have n equals 250, 248 you have data for, 2 you don't have data for, you'll need to make a copy of that variable and randomly go through and delete some of that data so you can do the same analysis that those of us that have missing data will do, okay? Does that make sense? Question?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
So you're saying for one variable we should have, because I had with my data set it was randomized, like the scale, like when they're presented, so you never knew who's going to get one first or last. So sometimes, it kind of randomized out. Like, so for instance, I may have 5 missing from one data, like from one scale, and 5 missing from another scale, and 5 missing from another scale, instead of 20 missing.
Yeah, but what you'd probably do with that scale is you're probably going to sum all of those together, right? To come up with one scale. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm
Are they
saying,
individual items that?
right, I'm saying like I have 4 scales.
Yep.
So I have people that only completed 3 of the 4 scales, but the 4th scale
Got
is
it.
different because they were randomized.
Got it.
So I
Got
don't
it.
know, like, so I don't have enough missing from one scale. So you're saying I should go through and just delete for that one scale?
Yes, you'll want to do that but I'm not sure that I fully understand. Are your scales all single items?
No, they're like up to 10 questions.
But if they did one of the questions, they probably did all 10 of the questions. Yeah. So that probably, yeah, I think you're probably right that you would have to go in and create some missing data in order to. Just depends on how much missing data you do have.
Okay.
How much? Any idea? What would be the most missing data that you'd have?
The most for any scale is 5.
N equals 5. Yeah, probably too low. So you could just go through, make a copy of one of those, go through and delete. What's your total N?
216.
Go through and delete another 20, 25, 30, every 5th one, every 10th one, whatever you decide to do to make it random. You could use SPSS to do it for you randomly if you were creative. Or you can just go through and click and go down the list and remove some and don't remove some others. So does it make sense?
Yes, sir.
Other questions? So we need to have some missing data in order to do missing data analysis, and so that's sort of step number 1. In the real world, I wish we had that kind of problem. In the real world, when you do data analysis, missing data there's no good solution. It's always a problem. And feel fortunate if you have data where you don't have much missing data, because that is in my experience atypical both for academic research that I did or for research, the kinds of work that I work on now. So what we want to do is once you have your missing data, you want to determine if the missing values are systematically or randomly missing, and we'll talk about how do we do that and what the heck does that mean. And then we want to report, as you would in a manuscript, MS, sent out for publication, the nature of the missing data and what action, if any, you would take. So you're going to determine if it's missing or not systematically or randomly missing. And then you're going to write up just a brief. It really would be, you'll see some examples that I wrote up, and I think it's 2 sentences, or maybe a single sentence. And that's what I'm expecting you to write. And I'll mention this probably more times than you care. Just don't take my sentence and plug in your variables. In some cases, just don't do that. Be creative and write it in if nothing else, just reverse the order or something if that's the only other way you can think to write it. And then so you're going to write a couple sentences that report as if you were writing a manuscript that you were sending out for publication, which you'll see that for every homework you do in this class, that's a part of the homework, where I give you an example of here's how I'd write this up, and then the expectation is you would take your data and write it up with your data, in that, again, not using some of that same logic that I use. And then I ask you to provide only the applicable SPSS output, of course, with syntax to document your claims. And so it might be that you have to do some finagling with your data to get it in the right order, or to wrangle different variables, or you might have to do some, you might just be playing around with SPSS, figuring things out. Don't include all of that output in the output you give me for this. Only include the relevant output to document the claim that you're making, that this data is either randomly missing or systematically missing, okay? So that's all I want to see. And then you're going to annotate the output with your relevant observations. So it would be like if you were looking on screen and scrolling down through your SPSS output, what would you be thinking? Oh, this t-test indicates that the data is systematically missing, and you would highlight the p-value and or maybe point out the p-value, and it would just be those kinds of annotations. There shouldn't be much output you give me that doesn't have some annotation associated with it, because if you're not thinking anything about it, there's probably no reason for me to see it either. So if you look through your output and you see, oh, I have 3 pages where I'm not saying anything about what the output means, you probably either should say something or just get rid of the 3 pages of output and include the page of output that has your annotation. An exception to that might be sometimes SPSS doesn't print in very friendly ways. So it will print a table, maybe have a really wide table, and it will only do, I don't know how many columns, and then it will start a new page, and then it'll start a new page, and then it'll start a new page until it gets the whole thing done. You can annotate the top of that and then include the rest of it, and I would know exactly what you're doing. It's all one table. That SPSS wasn't very kind in terms of how it printed it. And I don't know, if the table's this wide and you only have this much room to print on screen, there's probably not a good solution other than doing a carriage return and then adding to it. So that, does that make sense? So in terms of annotation, when we work through some of the examples here, I'll tell you here, if I was annotating this is what I would put. And so you'll have some examples and some intuition in terms of what I'd be doing. And then I guess number 5 there, I do ask you to, if you don't have any missing data, that you need to delete some missing data. Okay? Make sense? And so you're probably going to be working with 3 or 4 different variables here. That's all you're going to be working with. And so you don't have to do, if you want to, you can, but you probably won't have to use all of the data in your data set for the missing value analysis. If you were doing this for research, of course, you'd have to be more exhaustive, but for class, we can be less so. Okay? Make sense? Questions?
So what you said, does that mean that as far as the demographics, we should give our IDs, we only need to pick one demographic?
I think so, yeah. So if you had, let's say one of your independent variables was income. And there was missing data on income, you could pick 2 dependent variables to go along with that, and that could be your analysis, or a dependent and another independent variable potentially. Make sense?
Yep.
So that's B. C is we want to look to see if we have outliers, and outliers can be univariate outliers. An example would be if we had a sample of OU undergraduate students, and we had their ages, and then we had somebody that was my age, right? I'd be like 3 standard deviations from the mean. And so I'd be an outlier, right? And so that would be a univariate outlier. But then multivariate outliers would be sort of crossing. Maybe we do males and females and age. And so we cross those 2 variables. And we might have, in my case, again, a male who's 3 standard deviations from the mean. And that would be considered a multivariate outlier. And again, we could cross yet again with another variable, or cross with and in actuality, we would cross all of our variables, and we'll talk about that once we get to doing that multivariate outlier test. And so you're going to examine your data for univariate, multivariate outliers. You're going to report, as you would in a manuscript sent out for publication, the nature of the outliers in your data and what action you would take because of the outliers. And this would, again, be just 2 or 3 sentences. Here's the nature of the outliers, and here was my solution. I decided to delete the outliers. The person who was 80 years old was deleted from the sample, and so that would be a solution that we'll talk about, and in some cases probably not a bad option. So that's 1. 2 would be again your output, that document your claims, and again here applicable would be the operative word there, and then you're going to give me your annotations. Fair enough? And then D, 1D, is looking at normality, skewness, kurtosis. If you remember those from your introductory statistics class. We're going to look to see how skewed our data is. Look at the kurtosis, make some judgments about is the skewness significantly different than 0, or is it close enough to 0 that we could consider it to 0? And so we'll think about a way to do that, and we'll in fact do that. And then you're going to give me, as you would in a publication that you're going to send out, the condition of your data in terms of normality, and if necessary, what action you took. And the action will be, and we'll see this, that in many cases, a good case can be made for if you have a variable that's highly skewed, positively or negatively skewed, there's some transformations that we can do to that data that make all of the sense in the world to do. Some people would say, well, you're cooking the books, but they're generally people that are uninformed about why it's a good idea to do that. And so we'll talk about, well, why is it a good idea to do that? What is the logic behind doing a square root transformation or a square transformation or raising something to taking a log of something? What is what logic would sort of allow us to do that, and what argument would you make? And so we'll talk about that when we talk about normality. And then the 2 and 3 are the same, right? You're going to give me your output, applicable output with the syntax, and then you're going to annotate that output. And so I suspect, if this were me, I think this is how I would do it. I'm a little old school. I don't know. I guess I'd feel bad about it, but I think I'd print out all of the applicable SPSS output, and then I would annotate, because I like to write. I would write on the output the annotations with pen, and I'm perfectly fine with that as long as your writing isn't as bad as mine is. And so that would be a perfectly acceptable way of doing it. And then you would run it through a scanner downstairs and have it send you the PDF, and you'd upload that PDF to Canvas, and you're done. The other thing is, I think you can either copy and paste SPSS output to Word, or convert SPSS output to a Word document, and then do Word text box. If you don't want to handwrite and you just want to have it neater, or if that's your preference, that would be another option. And then you would just convert that Word document into, or whatever editing program you're using, convert that into a PDF, and you should be good. So either one of those options would work. For whatever reason, although I don't do it much anymore, I used to like to print everything out. I wanted to go through it page by page for some odd reason. I don't do that anymore. I rarely print anything out. But I think if I were in your shoes, I'd print it out. But you guys decide what makes the most sense to you. Questions?
Do you want us to kind of, and you may have mentioned this before, so I'm sorry if I missed it, work through this in kind of a Word document? So like, for instance, I get to D, and then I report this thing, and then you want the SPSS output there? Or do you want us to create like a appendices where we like refer back to this stuff.
I like the former better than the latter. That's a good point, Chris. That the organization of how you organize your homework is really important. If I start reading it and I get, halfway down one page and I just have no idea what you're doing or where you're at, that suggests to me that you don't know what you're doing. I mean, I don't know. I interpret that as you don't know what you're doing, you don't know where you're at. If you did, you would organize your output in a more reasonable fashion. So I think I like the idea of just, you could do an appendix, but I think I like the idea of it just sort of being in the same flow as each of the problems. And but again, if you thought an appendix for a particularly long table or something was better than putting it in the flow, I would read that, I'd see that, and I'd go back and look at it, and it would be just fine. Good question. Other questions?
Before determining if the missing value are systematically or randomly missing, you need to play around with the data.
Right, there's some tests that we'll run to make that determination, yes. So that's what we'll talk about here over the next couple hours is tests that we can run, the different types of tests that we run to make that determination, is the data systematically or randomly missing. And then that would be what you report. Other questions? Good. 4:30, right? We take a break. Is that sort of the normal? We're going to come back to these. Not yet, though, after a break. So starting with missing data. The pattern is more important than the amount. And the pattern would be, is it systematically missing or is it randomly missing? Randomly missing data can, well, and I probably say this somewhere. I know I've said it once already. But here's one. There's no good solutions to missing data. There's only a bunch of bad choices that you can choose from, and you have to just choose which of those are least painful. So the goal is to have no missing data. But if the missing data is randomly missing, that's a slightly better situation than if it's systematically missing. And you'll see why here as we move forward. The problem with that, though, is we can never be 100% confident that our data is randomly missing. We can only assess that given the variables that we've collected as part of our data. And so if you say, my data is randomly missing, I have no problems here, I probably would say time out. How do you know that it's randomly missing? And you'd probably say, well, I tested it against these different variables, and I could probably give you that many more variables that you didn't test that you never collected for either. And so we can only test so much we can only test what we have collected data to test against. But if you find that it's systematic, all you need to do is find one instance where the data is systematically missing. For example, maybe people who don't report their income, would they be more likely to make more money or less money, do you think? So let's say we're doing a survey, we're asking people what's your annual salary? Some people are going to tell us, I'm not telling you that, right? And so it'd be missing data, right? If they're not going to tell us that, who would be more likely to do that? The person that's on the higher end of the socioeconomic scale, lower end? What do you think?
I was gonna say,
No,
we tried to hire.
Huh?
It's actually
Well, we'll see, because that's what we'll do. Well, that's the variable we'll work with here in a minute. And I don't remember, to be honest with you, what it is. But we'll do that. But I think if we have that variable income and we find that higher, we find that there's some systematic pattern where maybe people who don't, maybe females are less likely to have missing data than males. Maybe, or maybe it's the reverse. That would be indicative of a systematic pattern. It's not 50-50 males and females with missing data. It's that males have significantly more missing data than females. All we need to do is to find one of those, and then we have to say that our data it's systematically missing. There's some mechanism that's leading to the missingness. It's probably not the best example. It's the gender of the person that's responding to the question, and there might be something going on there.
I was just thinking in relation to even the question about who's less likely to not tell us their income. The first thought that came to my head was not socioeconomic status, but for example, let's say culture. And I have collected both socioeconomic status and culture, but for some reason, based on the theory, it makes sense for me to look at why I did not include income alongside culture. Whereas later I realized, I could have looked at it against. But if I have a rationale, then and I'm writing it for publication, and I have a backing, or would it really be, I should have looked at it with everything I collected? Maybe there would have been a pattern with variable A.
You need to make the argument in the manuscript that you write for what you did, and if you can be persuasive and you only did it with one, then there's not a black and white. It's idiosyncratic, really, to the researcher and to your ability to make persuasive arguments. And the question that I asked earlier is probably not the best question, because if somebody doesn't tell us their income, we have no idea if they're a high income person or a low income person, right? And so that's an unknown, right? Because it's missing, right? We don't know what they are. And so the way that I phrased that, and that's the reason I changed it to male and female, because we would have collected that, maybe, right? We ask people how much they make. We ask them, and some people say, forget it, I'm not telling you. Even though we try to be persuasive in how we ask it. We try to be sensitive in how we ask it, and confidential in how we ask it, and have credibility. Some people are going to say, no, I'm not giving you that. But we probably also ask for whether they're males and females, right? And so that's what we would test against, because we don't know if they're the people that are telling us, that aren't giving us their income. We don't know what they make, and so we're not able to make that determination based on because it's missing, right? We don't know what they make, and so it's an unknown. So hopefully that makes some sense. As we continue to sort of work through, I think it will make more sense. But the takeaway here is the pattern matters more than the amount, in particular if it's systematic or non-systematic. Non-random or systematic missing data can affect the validity of our results. That is, a systematic portion or a non-random portion of your sample will not be represented in your data. It's not a random mechanism that leads to the missingness. It's a non-random function or mechanism that there's something else going on there that leads to a sample not being representative of your data. And it can be problematic in experimental research, in survey research, content analytic research, and so it's not just survey research or or just experimental research. And this is me being a bit cynical, but it's really born out of experience. It's rare that you pick up a journal article and read where somebody says anything about their missing data that day. And then I've been on enough dissertation committees where I ask students, well, tell me about the missing data in your study. And, well, I just let SPSS take care of that for me. And that might be your only solution. And you might just let SPSS take care of that for you. But one would want to hope that we can be a little bit more focused on that, or a little bit more deliberative in how we think about the missing data. And so, but it is quite rare that you see somebody talk about it. But that doesn't mean that that's right, and I really don't think it isn't right, I don't think. So why do we have missing data, or what are the mechanisms? Procedural factors could be that you did a Qualtrics survey. How many people have used Qualtrics? Nice tool. You can build in lots of logic. Sometimes your logic gets really complicated, and sometimes you can make, if you don't test it thoroughly enough, you can run a bunch of data through. You can collect a bunch of data, and you could be branching in one direction when you don't want to branch in that direction with a group of people, and that could be a procedural factor where you ended up with a bunch of people in one of your conditions, or that were a part of your study that, bless you, that were missing. So, and that would be an example of a procedural factor. Can anybody else think of another example of how some procedural way that we're collecting our data could lead to missingness?
For example,
I would say, I think maybe it's procedural, but it's just like participant fatigue. Like if you don't randomize your scales, in the last scale may get dropped more often.
Yeah. One of the first studies I did, paper and pencil days, on the same row, same line, I put like age, maybe it was just age, and then sex on the same row. But about 25% of the people didn't tell me whether they're male or female, because they just did that. They processed it in sort of, and you know how students do, they're not as careful with it, but it was really on me, and I would say that's a similar procedural complication or issue that led to missingness, and the people that just didn't tell me whether they're male or female.
One other thing I was thinking was like if there's been a policy change within the organization, or there's been a political development and we're testing for some such factor, then I've seen like very systematically the group that's affected would sort of see that they've responded to this.
So can you have an example?
I'm thinking of HR data, and I think we were collecting across different organizational levels, and we were collecting sensitive information around some leadership skills, some personality factors, and so on one of the leadership skills, I think there had been a policy change, like you couldn't discuss this with your manager or some so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that item was very systematically missing from everybody who responded to it, who was from HR. Whereas we had three kinds of groups. We had people from HR, we had people that were actually doing the technical work and salespeople, but those from HR refrained from responding to it because they had higher awareness of that policy.
I think that's a good example, and it would be, I had a boss, this was back when I was just out of college and I worked sort of a different life. He actually said, and it was the company I worked for, a large company, hired a consultant to survey the climate, and they sent everybody surveys, and we had to rate our boss, and he sent. At the time, there was no email, but we got some kind of message, maybe a voicemail message. Don't do that. Don't fill that thing out. And he just didn't want us to fill it out. Don't bother doing that, even though it came from corporate headquarters and they made it sound really, really important, which would be sort of and I don't know what he's worried about, that people would run him into the ground or what, but would be, I would think, probably be similar to.
And just a question, I was just thinking, like, what about silliness of the item? And the example I have for that is we were doing a 360-degree performance review, and our item was that all the subordinates had to rate the manager, and the item read, "This person is the greatest person in history." And so.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that even if I really thought the person.
And depending on culture, now this is a multinational organization that's located out of India, but it's based in China and Europe and Africa, but certain cultures systematically did not, and mostly Western cultures, he said we cannot say, but then everybody else. Yeah,
and I think these aren't mutually exclusive. It might that question or that kind of mechanism might fall into one of these others, but they certainly would be. It certainly could be the case. Another mechanism might, and different for sure, if you're working with large data, especially data collected by, Pew or American National Election Studies or General Social Survey, not everybody gets all questions, and so some questions just aren't asked because they only have so much bandwidth in terms of time that they can expect somebody to answer questions, and so they really try to autonomize that. And so in some cases, the person just isn't asked the question. In other cases, it might be some branching logic.
Excuse me, I need to get a DVD out of the player that I left
No
earlier.
problem.
Sorry.
I hope it's still there.
I do too. Thank you, I apologize for the interruption.
It could be an inappropriate question in that it's a branching logic. Maybe you ask a question about income, and people who make above a particular amount get one question, and people who make below that amount get another set of questions. Of course, it would be inappropriate. You wouldn't expect all of that data to be complete. There'd be some missing data there that you'd have to understand in order to be working with that data. It could be issues related to the respondent's willingness to answer the question, or you're doing a multiple, you're doing data collection at time 1, time 2, time 3, and you get 400 people to do it at time 1, you get 350 people to do it at time 2, and you have 300 people at time 3. Of course, you've lost 25% of your data by the time you get to time 3. And so that would be missing data that you need to do some assessment on. Or it could just be that I'm not going to tell you how much or how little I make. It's just none of your business. Or I'm not going to answer the dichotomy male-female because I just think that's a ridiculous question to be asking in this day and age. And so I'm just going to leave it blank. And so they just are unwilling to respond. For sure, if you're working with large sets of data, you need to be looking at code books, or if it's data that somebody else collected or data that you collected, you might have generated a code book. You can refresh your memory in terms of what are the missing what are the missing data codes that are being used, or markers for missing data. And I think it seems that we would think differently about a question that if I didn't even ask somebody a set of questions, it was an inappropriate question for them, just given some logic that I used for my data collection, we would think differently about those questions because, of course it's missing, I didn't even ask them, than the group of questions where I asked and they said, sorry, but I'm not going to give you any data there, right? So we need to be careful as you're working with your data. I don't think too many people given, although some of you are using larger survey data sets, and so there might be some of these issues that you have to go through, and just make sure that you don't conflate a question that was not even asked with one that they asked but people didn't respond to. So just a couple, and this is sort of my way of giving you some notes that you can refer to as you're working through the homework, and I do a fair amount of this. Just grab some screenshots from SPSS, throw some annotation on them, and I think it can be useful in some cases. There's no real order here to how these go, but if you click on in SPSS, there's what do they call it? It's the data tab and the variable tab, right? And so if you click on the variable tab, which is the view that I have here, there's one of these are called value labels. And in this case, a -1 means NAP or not appropriate. A 99 means they don't know. And a 99 means NA. And that's from the value labels. And then there's also in the same tab a place where you can flag your missing data. And so you can tell SPSS, treat -1, 98, and 99 as missing values. And it would treat those the same way as it would treat this, which is system missing data, the little period where it just there's nothing there. And SPSS by default, if you are entering data in and you don't have it, if you just leave it blank, it's going to put a period there for you. And that's referred to as system missing data. And so if you set these missing values, it will treat those 3 response categories the same as it treats this, unless you tell it to do otherwise. Does that make sense? So just make sure, my assumption is that most of you, your missing data is going to look like this. Larger survey sets will have, and again, some of you are using larger survey data. I'm not quite sure how they coded their missing data, but there might be some of this that they're doing as well that you'll just have to make sure that you understand.
Is there a normal, description for a 999? Or would that fall under probably not answer for 99?
So what's that?
I've seen some data sets that have 999, 3 9s as opposed to 2 9s.
Yeah, so if that's what your choice was, where you just wanted to, if somebody didn't answer a question, you wanted to use 999, you could just put that here.
Okay.
So instead of 99, you could do 999.
But there's no average for what that would normally mean. Like if you pick up a random data set and then it says 999.
No, the only one that I see probably more frequently than anything is actually minus 9999 and 6 9s. I see that, but there's a couple programs that use that. But that's probably, I don't think, what's most common is this. Just leave it as system missing data. Probably most data that academics collect, a survey that you do, an experimental study you do, whether it be Qualtrics or Mechanical Turk or whatever, or students in the participant pool, they're going to be people just leave them missing system missing data. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Other questions? So let me get through this, and then we're going to take a break. So and all I really care about is the identification of this or this. There are textbooks, and I could bring you in a couple books if you're interested. There are, and they're really not textbooks. They're academic writings on how we handle missing data, and whole books on the subject, and they get into a lot of detail, way more detail than most of us will ever care about. And so this isn't really even scratching that surface, but it does sort of lean in that direction just a little bit, and I'll explain what I mean as we go through it. But at the end of the day, what really matters is your data non-systematically missing, that is random, or systematically missing, that is there's some mechanism that's leading to the missing data. So we call non-systematically missing data missing completely at random in some cases. And in this case, there's no underlying missing data process that lends bias to the observed values. We can never be certain this is the case because we only have a finite set of variables that we can test against. There might be mechanisms that you never collected anything about that are leading to the missingness, and we'll never know that. But if you can make the case that with the data that you collected, using the best thinking that you have at your disposal, the theoretical understanding that is most state-of-the-art, if you can say there does not seem to be any systematically missing data, given the analyses that I did, that's probably the lead. That's not great because, of course, the data is missing. We're not going to just make up values to put in there. It's missing data that you have to still do something with, but it's least harmful. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. So that's randomly missing data. And then there's systematically missing data. And this vernacular, your textbook talks about it some, other books talk about it some. I don't really care for it. It's not intuitive, for me anyway. And again, I wouldn't get too caught up in it. So we have missing at random and not missing completely at random. And missing at random, the missingness predicts values of other independent variables in the data set. Doesn't seem like that should be missing at random, but why isn't that systematically missing? But that's just the name that gets put there. But it's still systematically missing. Again, these are the two labels that I care about. And so if we can predict the missingness with other independent variables, we say it's missing at random and not missing completely at random. The missingness predicts values of our dependent variable. And that's the more egregious of the two. And the terminology does suggest that there's not missing completely at random. Okay, so that's just a primer on systematically and non-systematically missing data. And again, we just want to make this determination. Is it here or is it here? And if it's here, again, it's going to be somewhat of you can never be certain of it. If it's here, if you find one instance of it, then okay, it's not missing, and then it's not missing completely, or it's systematically missing, and you would you could continue to assess that with other variables, but you would still make that case that it's systematically missing. So questions here? So we want to talk about how we make that diagnosis, but let's take a break. And at 45 minutes after 4, we'll start back up and we'll do some power problems. Thank you. I'll shut the recording up. We'll do some power problems when we get back, and then we'll retrain our brains on missing data.
Me? Oh, thanks to Will. I heard things.
Oh, you can go if your question's quick.
Are still attached.
Can I have a quick question?
Just 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm supposed to
They don't talk about it.
I just put all of it.
The picture.
Right now.
Yeah. I'm supposed to start like moving it and trying to hold it like
Did
something.
you get your charger?
They say like a cup full of water, but
Still need
for like
to-
30 minutes a day. Oh yeah, news to her.
Are you just into therapy?
Yeah, but I can't start that for another 2 weeks. 3 weeks. Yeah. I'm gonna start. I can do some stuff at home, like water thing, like carrying that 30 minutes a day. And then like, I hold my elbow and walk with fingers more. But until I start staying in range. But other than that, I have to. So I think when I'm sleeping,